So this is a bit of an atypical 4-piece cafe. We're going to look at CalderaRIP, and we're going to look at different ways to work with it. We look at the manual workflow and at ways to create a more automated workflow in CalderaRIP using hot folders, and then even looking at some automatic nesting solutions, ending with PrimeCenter and how PrimeCenter can automatically link in with CalderaRIP as well and create basically a fully automated workflow as long as you have a stable print process. If you have stuff that comes in a stable form factor that you always want to treat the same way, that you always export the same way, then you can use CalderaRIP fully automated with or without PrimeCenter to assist you with nesting and ganging. So let's start at the beginning. Let's start at how people typically work with CalderaRIP manually. You would start by booting up CalderaRIP, and it would look something like this. You would see your image bar on the one side and your tools on the other side, having just the two windows. Caldera always opens up everything in separate windows. So you can always move them around, put them on separate screens. If you have multiple screens, you can put stuff on one screen, put your spooler on another screen. Depending on how you work, you can build your display the way you want to. Then you would open up some files, and you can do this by just opening the file manager and navigating to where your files are. Typically, you would have some form of default file input, and that file input would be maybe your NAS, maybe some kind of folder locally on your system, a USB drive that you always connect. It doesn't really matter. You would have some place where your files typically come from. And you can add those places here below in the file manager. You can add some thumbnails that go to specific places on your drive. So I have, for example, a hot folder here, a thumbnail that goes to the Penguin folder. And in that Penguin folder, I have a few files. Now I can take these files and I can just open them up. There are some settings in the file manager, but these mostly have to do with how the preview image that you're loading into Caldera to work with visually in your interface is made. So you would use the Adobe PDF print engine. You can limit the resolution or the size of that preview image because you don't want to be working with huge files when you're just working inside the application. And you can also decide to load all pages of a document individually or just load page 1 and have all the other pages hidden behind page 1 in your interface. Of course, they will be printed completely normally. I'll open all 3 of these files together, so I can just click open. You can see it's loading one and it has some files queued. And there we go, we have our 3 penguins in the image bar. So I can close the file manager or I can put it somewhere on a different screen and look at it later again. It doesn't really matter. Now I have 3 files available. I can have a quick look at them by just double clicking. If I open it up a bit and I reset the view, it's a bit bigger and I can see my file. I can see, oh, this is a nice penguin. I see what's going on. I can also look at different separations. So I can, for example, turn off some separations and see what this file looks like with certain separations turned off or on. Okay, I have this image and now I would like to print it. I like to set up my Caldera interface to have my main tab, which is the workflow elements, the easy media, the file manager as one thing, settings, which are the server admin, the key manager, the config as a separate tab, and then I put my printers and cutters in separate tabs as well. Typically, you would only have your main and your settings tab, and then everything else would just appear in the main one. Depending on how you organize your workflow, you might want to play with this and set it up differently. You can do that from the config window. So if you open up the config window, you can actually see those tabs here. And you can add tabs, you can delete tabs, you can rename tabs, depending on how you want to set this up. So I can just add my printers from my list on the left. If I filter this on printers, then you see my devices. I can just click the arrow to add them to my application bar and have them visible in my printer tab. I would have to restart if I change anything. So I would take my file, I would drag it to my printer, or just open the printer and then drag it to it, and that would open up my printer driver. I can see in my printer driver my image here, the size it would usually be at, and that it also has a cut contour. The cut contour is automatically recognized because the file I loaded in, the PDF, has a spot color vector line, which has the spot color name cut contour, and that is one of the spot color names Caldera automatically recognizes as being a die line, which it will then automatically attempt to use. You can change the list of spot colors that are recognized as being die lines in the file manager settings. So if you have a different spot color that you like to use that isn't one of Caldera's default spot colors, it might be die line, it might just be contour or cuts or true cuts or something else from some kind of device, you can add those to the list so they are always recognized when a file comes in with one of those spot color vector lines. I can open in my file and I have some information here. I have some configuration that I want to print with. So I have the number of times I want to print it. Of course, I can decide that on the go. I have the resolution for my printer, the width of my media that I want to work with, the media itself, which color mode. And you can see I have several color modes available, the quality I want to print with, and then finally the action. All of this information is part of my print configuration, and I can save any combination of settings as a configuration to use again and again and again. That is useful because that way you can create different configurations for different kinds of practical workflows. If you always print stickers on a certain media, a cut vinyl that you want to use that has a certain width, and for which you have created a specific color profile for your printer, then you want to make sure that you always print those stickers with the same color settings, with the same media settings. So you always get a consistent result there. If on the other side, you also print stuff on a canvas substrate, then you would have to create a preset for canvas substrate. And then if you load in a file from stickers while you were working on canvas before, it's really easy to change back to your sticker workflow. If you have a configuration saved for it, you can just click the dropdown and change your workflow to a different workflow, and then it changes all the settings along with it, depending on what you have set up beforehand. That way, you never have to worry about changing all the different dropdowns back to what they were supposed to be. Now, you might have already seen that in several of these dropdowns, a lot of the information in there is in red and some are in white. The availability of the options depends on the color profile you have available on your system. You have to create a color profile for a certain resolution on a certain media using a certain mode and a certain quality. All these things are related to the color profile. So if I were to print using 720 resolution instead of 720 by 1440, then it would tell me that I don't have a color profile for that setup on that media. So I can't really do that while being color accurate. So I have to use settings that are available. Sometimes text is in purple, and if it is in purple, that typically means that you can print it while you don't have a specific color profile for it. You have one that is close enough so it can extrapolate the information and give you some kind of result. So purple would work, but would not be 100% accurate. While white means, of course, you have a profile available and you are able to print using these settings. So once I have this set up, I can basically just say print. Now, there are a few more things here. There are a few more tabs, and these are more refined settings for your print setup. I always like to have a look in the page setup window. The page setup window shows you a preview of what your print is actually going to look like. And one of the things I see, for example, is that I don't have the 100% button enabled. If I have this enabled, then whenever I open a file, it is going to be forced to be printed at 100% scale, which for this image is 250 millimeters. If I don't have this enabled, I can just make this a different size and print it bigger or smaller. So I like to do this with this toggle on to make sure that I always print everything at the intended size. The opposite of that is to just print as large as possible. And you can have this toggle to print as big as you can on the selected format. The format is the widest roll my printer can handle, which is a 24 inches roll. But I prefer this. Then another thing you have is you can align on either the left or the right side. You can see I can toggle this on or off. And we can also just center the image. And I also like to center the image, especially when you're doing a higher count, when you print 2 or 3 or 4, or you print smaller elements. It's nice to have them centered on the page and then go through the width, rather than have everything always on the far left or far right. And then we have the bottom button here, which is the orientation. And typically I leave that on automatic. Why? Because it will automatically decide how to print the image to use the least amount of your roll. So if I have it on automatic, and you see when I make it as big as possible, it automatically turns 90 degrees because it can make it bigger. So it decided that because I asked for as big as possible. While if I say put it on 1 by 1, then it will take it in the width, so it doesn't use as much of the substrate of the roll. Okay, so that's one thing. Then I see on the right here, I have all these options. I can have the double-sided printing action on, which will add side A and B information to my print and align it to one side. Then I can also have certain marks. Right now, I don't have any extra marks enabled, because this is a print with a cut line that is going to be cut on a Summa plotter, so I don't need to have normal crop marks, but I could add normal crop marks. I can just toggle any of these that I want on or off. If I make this a little bit bigger, it'll be more visible what actually happens, but I can turn all of these toggles on or off, and then we see all the extra information just pop up on the preview here. You can see there's now crosses, there's now crop marks here in the corners, more crosses on the side, and I can also turn all of that off again. It's the same for bleed. Bleed is disabled by default, and for this file, bleed wouldn't be very useful anyway, because it's an irregular shape and it has a white margin to the cut line, so it's supposed to be printed with a bit of a white border, so there is no overlap with the die line. But you could enable bleed, and then you have all the bleed options available in that window as well. There's a bunch more options, but we're not going to go through everything here. One more thing that is interesting is the step and repeat. This is actually the same option you have here for the amount of copies. I can say I don't want just one of these prints, I want 2, and then you see it adds 2 next to each other, and it still keeps them centered because of my center option. And if I say 3, 4, 5, it just keeps adding penguins. Now, if I change the size for this, and I make this 175, for example, and then I go to step and repeat, and I say I want 2, 3, you can fit 3 next to each other instead, and I can go on and on and on as well. You saw maybe when I made it smaller, and I go less than 2 copies, that it doesn't actually create a Summa code properly because it's not wide enough. The Summa has a width that it requires for like 220 millimeters, so 22 centimeters, that it requires to properly show the barcode for the OPOS. So I would have to print at least 2 to have that visible, or just print them on 1 by 1 size. And then we have the cutting option, and the cutting option is creating that Summa mark. If I turn it off, then we won't have the Summa mark. You can choose your cutter, you can have your cutter settings and the IP address and everything linked to that. But mostly it decides on how to create the code. If I have a Summa, it creates an OPOS. If I have a Zund selected, it would create my Zund dots. All of that is part of that. And you see automatically it recognized the contour, which was called cut contour. The cut is enabled for it, the print is disabled for it. So it will not print my cut contour, but it will use it obviously to cut when it's sending a file to the cutter. I can change those options by just selecting the cut and print buttons when I have one of these lines selected. Okay, so if I'm happy with this, I can close this page setup window, And everything I did there is remembered. If I go back into it, we will see that it still has all the same information here. This information is remembered when I close this window, and it is also part of my configuration here. So if I decide to save this now, it will override my previous configuration, and it will always try to print 2 of them with the Summa cutter activated as well. So all of that is part of that. The same thing here with this edit information. The fact that it's going to try to cut the media that I'm using a roll is part of that. All of this information comes from my profiler. I created a color profile using the Easy Media module. If you haven't used that yet, it's a really easy to use profiling wizard that you can use step by step to create a color profile for your printer. And the options are in there. Then we have the spooler, and then we have 2 windows, one to handle spot colors and one to handle the normal color management. These settings are also all part of your configuration. So my typical workflow would be to use a default config and perhaps update the number of copies that I want to print, and then I would say print. Now I don't have a printer connected, so I set my action to rip. And that rip action will mean that the file gets ripped and it gets put into my spooler, but it's not automatically sent to the printer. I would have to go to the spooler and say print to get it into my printer itself. If I want to immediately start printing, I can choose the print option, and then I would immediately start printing, but I don't have the printer at home. I can open my spooler using this button or the spooler button here in the settings, or just have it open as a separate application. And then we have the spooler here. We see my printer is available, and we see the file I just sent to the printer is available here as well, and is ready to be printed, has a cut line enabled, all of that is present. So that would be the fully manual flow. Opening files using File Manager, sending them to your printer driver, and essentially saying print. And the few optimizations I do is that I load them in with the correct File Manager settings, and that I have several of these configurations created in advance, so I can easily select the configuration that I want to use for printing every single time. And that saves a lot of time to have proper configurations, because you don't have to think about it anymore. You make less mistakes. You can just say, okay, print this file for my stickers, print this file for my canvas, and it will automatically get the right configs for you. Okay, so there are a few more things though. There are some tools in Caldera that we haven't looked at. For example, I just made 2 copies of this one penguin. Now, if I want to print my second penguin, I can take my second penguin and I can decide to print a number of copies of this file. And I print all my files individually. Now, using the width of the roll, I wouldn't have made a lot of advantage printing them together. But if I have to print maybe 50 or 100 of these, and I also know that I'm going to have to print 50 or 100 of those and 10 of those, I can print all of those together as well. And there's a few ways to do that. The manual workflow would use Compose. So if I open up Compose, I get the width of my roll right away visible in my editor here. And I can just say, okay, I need a bunch of these. I'll hold the Alt key and I'll drag that onto my Compose. If it lets me. Is it the Control key? It's the Control key. So I hold the Control key and I drag it onto my blank canvas here. And then it asks me, how many of these do I want? Well, let's say that I want 25 of those. So I'll fill in 25, enter, and it will load 25 of these all together. Now, these are a bit big for the example, so I'm going to grab them all and change the size to maybe 33%. Does that do anything when I do it like that? It doesn't look like it. Is it because I had all of them selected? Yes. So I can't do that with all of them selected. I can do it one by one, but that's a bit annoying. Let's see if I can do it by changing the width of them. Otherwise, I have to change my file in advance, but no, it doesn't look like I can do that. Okay, so it doesn't matter. I'll just use big files then, and I'll cheat and I'll make my roll a bit bigger. That way, if I make this like 750, There we go. Then I have a bit more space on my roll. Of course, I won't be able to print that, but that's fine for the example. So I have all of those files loaded. I'm going to get a bunch of those as well. So I'll hold Control, drag that in, and say maybe I want 33 of those, and they're coming in. And then I also want maybe 2 or 3 of these. There we go. And now I have all those files on my roll. Now, what I want to do is I want to have all of these nested together properly using their irregular shape and all of that stuff. And I can just click a button here. There we go. And you see it nested all of my files nicely onto the size of the roll that it had available. If I make this a bit bigger, I can zoom in a little bit. There we go. So you see how it nested everything where there was a bit of space available. On my roll, it placed all of those files. And I can redo that if I need to do it. Did I mess up when I added in my chopsticks? Because I don't see the chopsticks. I wanted 33 of those. Okay, there they are. Now they're all in there, and I can redo this with my new chopsticks in there, and now it adds them as well. You see, it added some of them here on the sides because it had some space available there, so I'm able to optimally use my space. I did add a little bit of margin here. I don't actually need to do that for this file. Now, even though maybe it's interesting for the cut line, this is typically to have space for bleed available. Okay, so once I'm done and all my stuff is added in here, I can just say create new composite document, and it will give me one file. I can close this then because it's done. It will give me one file that is the width that I defined. So typically that would be the exact width of my roll, but I cheated a little bit so I could get a little bit more effect here of what I was doing. And I can just drag that to my printer and then print that file. So if I now go to page setup and I don't have my one-on-one selected, but just the biggest size it can fit on my 24-inch roll, then I can print this file, scale down a little bit for this printer, and I have a nested document. But that's still a manual action. So let's look at a different way of doing this. Instead of using a manual action, we'll look at an automated way to get the same thing done in CalderaRIP. So if I take again my first file, my first penguin, and let's say I want to have a bunch of them. So I'll choose my nest action and I'll say I want to have 33 of these, but I also already know that I don't want them this big. I want them to be, that's odd, it didn't automatically rotate it back to landscape this time. I want them to be only maybe 100 wide. There we go. It looks like that deformed it. Let's just redo that. Not sure what happened there. 1-on-1, and then I'll rotate it to normal. And then I will say the scale of this should be like 33. That should do it. Yeah, there we go. And I want not just one of them, I want to have like 33 of them as well. And then I'll say nest. And if I say print now, what it's going to do is it's going to send these 33 penguins to the Nestomatic. That's an automated nesting tool that is set up in your preferences to try and collect files until certain conditions are met. And when those conditions are met, it's going to create one big file that is sent to your RIP that is printed and that is then coming out of your printer to use with all of those files collected together. So it's doing that now. And then I can take a second file. I can open that one up and I can say I want 50 of these. I would have to go again to my setting here to see that the scale is okay. Sure, let's also do that one smaller. I have nest selected as the action, and I'll say, go ahead and do that. And now it did that again. And you see it says waiting. It's waiting for more files or for me to say, I'm done. You can go ahead and nest this. So if I take this one as well, and I say, maybe I want 10 of these penguins, And I also say, sure, nest those files as well. There we go. And now I'm basically going to say I'm done. I didn't give it any ending conditions. I didn't say, oh, you have to do this amount of files before printing. That means that my Nestomatic is just going to keep going until I say it's done. So if I look here in my spooler, I have a file called autonest1. And I'll try to make the spooler a little bit bigger so you can see it better. Well, that doesn't help much. But it says autonest1. It's a composite document. It's a ripped file. It's ready for me. It also says that all of these files were sent to Nestomatic. So it tells me that I did that. And this is the file it created from that. And then you see here at the bottom the preview for it. So it contains all my big penguins, all my little circle penguins, and all the chopsticks here at the bottom, very, very small. And once I'm ready with this, I can just right-click it and say print. And then this is going straight to the printer. And it's automatically nested. Now, I left this on manual. I told it that I was going to say print. But of course, I can predefine when that is going to happen. And you can do that from the server admin. So if I go to server admin and I go to my printer, my Stylus Pro 77900, and I go to configure, then I have a Nestomatic tab. And in this tab, I can say, oh, I want that the minimum 80% of my paper RIP is being used before you start printing my file. I also want to use at least 100 millimeter of print depth. 100 millimeter is not a lot. Maybe I should make that 1,000. So I'm using at least like a good meter of print length. And I want the max of this to be 2 meters, because after that it's no longer manageable. So I'm going to see at least 1 meter and maximum 2 meters should be taken into account. And now you see the print starts when at least 80% of paper width is used, printed length is at least 100 millimeter, and printed length and if printed length would exceed 2 meters as well. Of course, you can keep waiting forever in that case until you reach that amount of prints. So we can also say, if nothing else goes into the Nestomatic for 15 minutes, then you can also go ahead and print because I won't have those files wait in there forever. And now when these conditions are set, everything will automatically go to the printer when you have enough files available. Okay, that's great. Now that that is all set up, but I still have to manually open files and send them, right? Well, no, you don't really have to do that, because now we look into the more automatic ways to work with these functions. You can actually use hot folders with Caldera that send your files automatically through the settings that we just looked at. If you're already using default configurations here, you already have a setting that a workstation where you set up certain configurations to work in a certain workflow and to always do the same thing, then you don't need to go through this window. You can just set up a hot folder on your desktop or in some location on your system, and all the files that go in there will get automatically sent through the same configuration. So if I have a hot folder set up, and I can do that by just going to my special tab and select hot folders, you see I have a few hot folders already running on my system. I can just set up a folder on my system. For example, I have this Caldera in folder on my desktop. If I just take a file and I drop it into that folder, then we should see it go straight to the spooler. And I have it, what was that hot folder set up at? Let's have a look again. It's going to go straight to the Stylus Pro print configuration. Okay, so if I look at my print configuration, and I just select it again to make sure it's in its default state, that is going straight to the RIP. So if I take a file, and I'm gonna take a penguin again, and I just copy my penguin into my Caldera in folder, then if I have my hot folders available, we'll actually see it. You see there are some files coming in through my system. It says executing, it opened up the file here on the left, loaded it into the system. There's no errors, and it should already have gone to the spooler. So if I now open up my spooler, we should see, yeah, there we go. That's not the right one. Oh, it's still going. You see it here. It's actually still working on it. So there is a file that is going through my system. I'm not sure where it is right now. Is it this one? It's probably this one. Yeah, in progress 31%. but this file is being ripped right now and it came from my hot folder. So I don't have to manually throw files in there every single time. And then, of course, we just said you can combine that with your Nest-O-Matic. So if I quit this again, and instead of sending it to the print config, I would send it to the nest config, then all my files going through that hot folder would go into the nest config. Of course, I have to set that in the hot folder tab here. I would have to edit this hot folder and say, send it to the, I can go to the menu here, Caldera, printer, my printer, and then I should have to select the nest one. And then it will send those files to the nest config and nest them up until conditions are met, after which they are sent to the printer directly. So that is already pretty much an automated way of working with Caldera if you have a consistent workflow. If you have a lot of manual files that you do one by one, then that is a bit more difficult to do using this flow. But if you have a consistent workflow, you print a lot of the same types of files, you can just use a hot folder and send the files through there and just automatically process all of them. Okay, so that's there is one more thing I would like to show you in Caldera to do with automatic workflows, and then we can have a quick look at how PrimeCenter fits in all of this. So there's one thing that I skipped so far, and that is that you actually have a workflow element in CalderaRIP. And the workflow element, I don't use it that much, but it can sequence actions in your Caldera flow. So I can have one of these styling plus modules linked directly to one of my printer flow settings. So for example, what that would look like is if I have a file that comes in, maybe you have seen already what the tiling module looks like. I would have to load in my file. So let's just open that up. If I go to my penguins and then I go up a little bit, I have a billboard folder and I have a file available that is a 5 meter wide billboard. I'm loading it into the current tab here. It should pop in any second. 98%. There we have it. So now I can take this, of course, 5 meters is way too wide for me to print. So I can open it up in my tiling module. I can say, I want to use this printer. I want to use this roll width. Let's see what kind of tiles I can make using those settings. Now my tiles are set to create 85 tiles. That's crazy. So let's recompute the tiles to have as little tiles as possible. Print constraint, recompute time. Why is it going to have like 85 tiles? I must have a setting wrong. Oh, that's odd. Let's go for 8. No, 9. I probably have a setting wrong somewhere, something to do with margins or whatever. You can see how it creates individual tiles for my document. All of these tiles would be loaded into my Caldera system, and it would automatically send these individual tiles to my printer. Yeah, I'm not sure why it does that. Maybe my file is too wide or something like that. Oh, this is why the poster size is set way too wide. This is only supposed to be 5,000 by 1,800. There we go. And now I can compute these tiles and I have the actual result. And once I'm done here, I can say create poster, create all tiles, create new poster. And then I have this file here, which actually contains all of these individual pages, which are individual tiles. And you can see some of them are turned upside down because I have this setting enabled, so you don't see a little bit of banding between the left and right side of the printer. I can quit that, and then if I take my printer again, and I take this poster and I send it to my printer, and I put it on the print workflow, which is actually set to RIP, and then I say print tiles. Oh, it looks like my one-on-one is not activated. Now print tiles, there we go. And now it's sending them to my spooler. And we should see, once I'm able to select the spooler, that we have, there we go, a whole bunch of individual tiles that have been ripped and that are available for print, or it would have already been sent to print. That depends on my setting, of course. And in this workflow module, I could automatically do these two steps. I could send the file into a hot folder that ends up in that styling module that has a certain setting, and then straight to this printer module, which also has a bunch of settings. And then I don't have to manually go through these two steps, and I can still use that tiling module the way I would want to. So that's the workflow thing inside CalderaRIP as well. So I already said outside of Caldera, we also have PrimeCenter. It's a fairly new product that is meant for better automated nesting. And I actually have a recipe set up. I'm not going to do a complete demo of PrimeCenter, but I'm just going to have this recipe that I set up that is an automatic recipe. I'm just going to start it up and see it go into action. So what it's doing now is it's checking a hot folder that I have where certain files are placed, which I want to print. You see the files are coming in. I have one file here already, and the file name actually says how many times I want that. It says I want it 30 times. So if I take another one, it says I want 25 of these. This file name is being parsed in the application, and it's going to automatically take that number of files into my system. It also automatically recognizes that cut contour with the right color, and it's already working on layouts here at the bottom. It's already combining my files together. Once it's done loading all of the individual files in, you see there's two more files that just came in. Once it's done with that, you'll see here, it's going to finish up these layouts. So this is one of the layouts. This is already a second layout. There's already a third layout. It's going to finish up these layouts and export these PDFs, these really big PDFs that are 1250 by 2500 millimeters. And it's going to put them right away into an input hot folder for my CalderaRIP. So let's see when it's done. And then if I go back to my Caldera and I go to my spooler, we should see as soon as it's done, that is, if my spooler has already finished with those tiles I sent it earlier, we should see as soon as it's done that this big nested document from, no, it looks like I broke it. I probably have to just restart it. There we go. And then have my spooler open. Okay, there we are. And we should see, there we go, all of these files are already ripped, are already available in my spooler. Here at the bottom, all of these big files are there already. So if I have a PrimeCenter set up that is automatically using a hot folder to input files, parsing some metadata from those files, executing a PDF Toolbox pre-flight profile on those files to make sure that they are correct, nesting them together, ganging them into groups if I want them to, and then exporting a PDF, again, with a Toolbox pre-flight for PDFX standard or whatever, and then putting them in a hot folder for Caldera, and I can automatically send these right to the spooler to get them printed on my system. And that way, we would have a completely automated workflow that starts just by throwing some files in a folder. Now, of course, since we're talking about throwing files into folders and having stuff happen to them, you could link that up with something like an Enfocus switch workflow and have it be a lot more complex there as well and do a lot of stuff. But that's not necessary because CalderaRIP and PrimeCenter already have a bunch of tools available to automate that whole flow. Okay, that's about what I had prepared for this cafe. So I hope that you found this interesting, that it was at least somewhat valuable, showed you how you can use CalderaRIP manually and with a little bit more and then a lot more automation on your site. If you want to see what PrimeCenter is like, I'm pretty sure we have a pretty good PrimeCenter demo video already available on our YouTube channel. So you can see a complete demo on how I actually set up that automatic flow and what the recipes are like if you just check out that video. Of course, this was also recorded and it's going to be put on YouTube. So if you want to rewatch any of this for whatever reason, go ahead. And then if you have any questions, just send us an email. Or if you want to ask anything now, go ahead and ask now. The silence is deafening. I must have been really clear in the explanation. Okay, then I would like to thank you again for showing up to this webinar. It was a little bit of an atypical compared to our usual menu, I guess. But I'm glad we still were able to put something together, and I hope that it has been useful. I wish you all a good evening.